Welcome to Romans lesson chapter 8. We are kicking off in chapter 4 around verse 13. But before we do, a couple of introductory remarks to kind of get us in the flow of things. As you recall, Paul is trying to get the church there in Rome and anyone who will listen to understand that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And they have to understand that that is for everyone who believes. And he even says to the Jew first and to the Gentile. Now, we understand the trouble that Paul would have and did have with respect to preaching the gospel to the Jews. The Jews are thinking, wait a minute, we have the law of Moses. Wait a minute, we have the rite of circumcision. Wait a minute, we are special in God's eyes already. We don't need another method as preached by Paul. And so that's why Paul ran into so much trouble, is they had placed all their stock in the law of Moses and failing to understand the weakness and the deficiency of the law of Moses that had been there all along. So they were adamantly opposed in many cities and such to what Paul had to preach. Well, they needed to learn that they needed the gospel just like the Gentile needed the gospel, that they needed the grace of God just like the Gentile needed the grace of God, because they were going to be judged just like the Gentile would be judged. And as such, if they didn't understand and if they hadn't accepted the gospel that Paul preached to them, they would be found wanting and they would not be justified in God's sight. So Paul's got to help them to understand this principle of righteousness, this principle of grace, this principle of justification that comes from true faith. In chapter 4, we jumped in and we saw Paul using the example of Abraham and how Abraham is so pivotal to the Jewish heritage, because through Abraham was a promise of the coming Messiah, which that was Jesus that came there in the first century. Now, because they had to understand that, they were tending to reject what Paul had to say. That's why Paul brings up Abraham. Abraham is the ultimate example in the Jewish mind. He is the person that they sought to figure their heritage from. He became, in the Jewish mind and in the Old Testament, the father of the Jewish nation. And so they revered Abraham and his influence and his lineage within the Jewish society. So Paul goes to and talks about Abraham, and he says Abraham was faithful to God. And then Paul makes a rather astounding statement to the Jews. His faithfulness was credited to Abraham as righteousness by God himself. And they had to understand that. And then when Paul talks about the faith of Abraham being credited to him as righteousness, the Jews are going, okay. So then he says, and you have to remember, when it was credited to him as righteousness, he was not circumcised. When it was credited to him as righteousness, there was no law of Moses. And so they have to understand that how important faith was and how important the grace of God was. Now, he gets into a discussion of the difference between righteousness through faith and the attempted righteousness through works. The Jews placed great stock in the law of Moses and in the works, that is, the commandments of the law. But we understand, as Paul said, that the works of the law, by such no man would be justified. It required the grace of God. All that the law did is it provided a knowledge of sin. And by providing a knowledge of sin, it provided a knowledge of the purity of God. The law of Moses did not remove sin. So if they still had sin when they died, they would not be justified in God's sight. It required faith and it required the grace of God to be justified, even if you were under the law. So Paul is trying to bring them along to help them to understand that, so that they see the need for the gospel. We pick up in Romans chapter 4 and 13. Again, Paul is talking in chapter 4 about Abraham. And we know that Abraham, in verse 13, for the promise to Abraham or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world was not through the law, but through righteousness of faith. Nothing could be justified through the law. Only one person could be justified through the law of Moses, and that was Jesus. Because Jesus lived the perfect life. He lived the life where he never violated the law. So because of that, he was pure in God's sight, and that made him the perfect sacrifice for us. That he lived a law of purity. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is nullified. For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, there also is no violation. We can't be justified. The Jews couldn't be justified by the law, because they could not be justified by works, because they could not live according to the law of Moses without violation. That just wouldn't happen. So because they couldn't do it, they needed the grace of God. And they needed the grace of God so that they might be justified in God's sight and justified through the gospel. Now he says again in verse 12, in the fathers of verse 14, for if those of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise is nullified. If the Jews could live perfectly according to the law of Moses, they would not need the promise of God to send the Messiah. If they could live perfectly, there would be no sin that they would have to have forgiven, and consequently they would not need a Messiah. It would be of their own volition and of their own capabilities that they truly live perfect in God's sight. He says in verse 15, for the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, there also is no violation. Which we understand. If there's no law against it, then to do it is not wrong. However, if there is a law, as in the law of Moses and these commandments, and we violate them, that becomes sin. Now, Jesus needed the law of Moses. Now, and you ask, well, why did Jesus need the law of Moses? Because Jesus needed to show to mankind that he lived a perfect life. Well, in order to show that he lived a perfect life, he had to have laws that could be violated to show that he did not. So he needed that law. He needed that law to help them understand that he became the perfect sacrifice. He needed that law because they needed to understand what the potential for violation of that law was, and that Jesus did not violate it. We go back to Abraham, and that's why Abraham needed the grace of God so that his faith could justify him and credit him with righteousness in God's sight. But as Paul reminded them, Abraham was justified in the sight of God. His faith meant he was credited with righteousness. That's true, but that took place, as Paul reminds them, that took place before circumcision. Circumcision had nothing to do with his being judged or credited with righteousness. Nothing to do with it. All it was a token that showed that he had been faithful. Also, Abraham could not have lived without violation according to the law of Moses. Well, to begin with, the law of Moses didn't come along till 430 years after Abraham lived. If we read Galatians chapter 3, verse 17, what am I saying to this? The law which came 430 years later does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God so as to nullify the promise. That is, the law came along, it didn't produce justification, it didn't produce redemption, it didn't produce forgiveness, and it didn't produce purity. All it did is produce sin. And so, as it says, because the law came along, it didn't nullify God's original promise. They still needed God's promise. Galatians 3 and verse 18, for if the inheritance is based on law, it is no longer based on a promise, but God has granted it to Abraham by means of a promise. So they should have been waiting for the promise because they should have recognized the deficiency of the law of Moses. Now, the law in and of itself was perfect. It was perfect in giving the Jews a knowledge of sin. But it was never intended to produce righteousness. It was never intended to produce justification. In that sense, the law could not help them. It was perfect for its purpose that God intended, but as far as what the Jews expected from it, the law couldn't do that. And so we find that in Galatians 3 and verse 21, read a little bit longer, is the law then contrary to the promises of God? No, it's not. The promises of God had to show us and show the Jews that we need the grace of God. That's what the law did. The law also needed to show that Christ lived a perfect life. Now, if there was no law of Moses and Jesus lived, then we would say, well, he's just a nice guy. We could not say he was a perfect person because we wouldn't have the law to compare his behavior with what God commanded. But what we do see by the law of Moses was there for a purpose, to give people the knowledge of sin and to show that Jesus lived a perfect life, that he did not violate it. For if a law had been given which was able to impart life, then righteousness would indeed have been based on law. But to do so, we would need the law and obey it without violation. Again, that was impossible for us to do. So he's bringing up Abraham, and he's showing how Abraham was righteous in God's sight because of his faith, not because of circumcision. That hadn't taken place, not because of his perfect performance of God's law and living according to his works. Abraham couldn't do it. So Abraham needed the grace, and therefore all who followed, particularly his lineage, the Jews, also needed his grace. We see what Abraham did, but we kind of want to define Abraham's faith. Now, you might say faith is faith. Well, not necessarily. Let's kind of take a quick sidebar for the moment, and let's define not just faith, but let's define Abraham's faith, because it was Abraham's faith that credited to him righteousness in God's sight. And I think I'm going to need a chisel to get this ink off here. There we go. Now, we can define faith several ways, but what we want to define for the purpose of the discussion is the faith of Abraham. What was his faith that caused God to credit to him righteousness? And I think that's very important. If we read Genesis chapter 17, we read about Abraham receiving the promise. And let me read that for you. In verse 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? What has happened is God has spoken to Abraham and told him about the fact that Abraham would have a son. And through that son would be his lineage, and through that son would eventually come, we understand, the Messiah. You recall when God made that statement to him. Abraham was 100 years old, or 99, I guess. And Sarah was 99, very old, far beyond the ability to have children anymore. And so he's told that he would have a son, and through him would be the promise of the coming, we understand, the coming Messiah. Then it says in verse 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? That is amazing news, to have the message from God saying you're going to have a son. And here he's 99 years old. Sarah's 90 years old. They're well past childbearing age. What God has told Abraham in Abraham's mind is impossible. And he understands that it is impossible. And it says when he receives the news, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And some people have identified that, the fact that Abraham laughed, that somehow that was, that's impossible. That'll never happen. That Abraham is laughing because it'll never happen and can't be done. However, that's not the case for Abraham, and that's not the case for Abraham's faith. Verse 18, and Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But God said, no, but Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. So God said, I'm serious. This is the promise. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Verse 21, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. So we're kind of wondering about Abraham's reaction. God says, you're going to have a son. You're going to have a son about this time of year. Abraham remembers that he's very old. Sarah's very old. They're well past the childbearing age. And in response to that, he laughs. He does mention Ishmael. He says, I have a son through Ishmael. God says, I'll take care of Ishmael. But I'm still going to give you a son whom you're going to name Isaac. And he is the one through whom I will bless your lineage. And so God is asking Abraham to accept and to believe and have faith in the impossible. Now, we have to remember how Abraham reacted to that. It says he fell on his face and laughed. So it's important that we define the faith of Abraham to see exactly what is going on so that God would credit to Abraham righteousness because of his faith. Because on first blush, it sounds like Abraham's going, it's impossible. That'll never happen. But that's not Abraham. That's not Abraham. Let me give you a couple examples. In Luke chapter 1, there's two examples that are very important that we should think about. The first is Zacharias. Zacharias was the father of John the Baptist. Secondly, there's Mary. Mary, of course, the mother of Jesus. Now, both of these receive news. They receive news from an angel sent by God. In the case of Zacharias, in Luke chapter 1, we read verse 18. Zacharias said to the angel, how will I know this for certain? The angel has come and told Zacharias that he and Elizabeth would have a son, whom we know to be John the Baptist. And at the time, Zacharias, who is a Levite, a priest, is at the altar of incense inside the temple, and the angel appears to him and makes this announcement. Zacharias' response is, he says, how will I know this for certain? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years. Sounds kind of like Abraham, the same scenario with respect to Abraham. Zacharias, who is very old, Elizabeth is very old, they also are well past the childbearing age, is told that he would have a son in his advanced years. The angel answered and said to him, I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you shall be silent and unable to speak until the day when these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their proper time. So, Zacharias was rebuked by the angel. It says of Zacharias and Elizabeth before that they were very faithful Jews. Zacharias of the tribe of Levi, and who served in the temple, was it says of both of them they had lived in faithfully all their lives. And then the angel comes, gives him the news, and he says, you shall be silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words. And we think about, wait a minute, Zacharias was a Jew. He believed in the law of Moses. He had faithfully tried to observe the commandments of the law of Moses. He had done so to glorify Jehovah. And yet the angel says you do not believe. So we have to understand the faith of Zacharias and the implications of that, and we have to understand the faith of Mary. If we read that on down in Luke chapter 1, verse 34, when after Mary had received the news that she would be the mother of the appointed one, the Messiah, and that she would be the mother of the appointed one as a virgin, she's thinking, well, that's impossible. Mary said to the angel, how can this be, since I am a virgin? The angel answered and said to her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. And for that reason, the Holy Child shall be called the Son of God. And behold, even your relative Elizabeth has also conceived a son in her old age, and she who is called barren is now in her 6th month. Mary's reply to this, for nothing will be impossible with God. That's what Mary said. Now, faith, think about that. Faith with doubts. It almost sounds, the terms almost sound mutually exclusive. How can you have faith and doubt at the same time? It seems that if you have doubts, you can't have faith. So they kind of mutually exclude one another. It's almost like an oxymoron. But it is not wrong to have doubts if we understand the reason for this doubts. In Zacharias' case, his faith, his doubt was if God can do this, then I will believe. In the case of Mary, her doubt was, how will God do this? But in Mary's case, she didn't know how God would do it. But you remember her answer? Nothing is impossible with God. Her faith was God could do it. In the case of Zacharias, his faith was if God could do it. So, if doubts are no faith. How doubts, kind of sounds like an idiot. How doubts are justified. Mary had how doubts. How is God going to do this? I know that he can, I just don't know how it's going to happen. In the case of Zacharias, it was if doubts, if God could do this. Now, what was wrong with Zacharias coming to that conclusion? There's an angel standing right next to him. Matter of fact, the angel says, I am Gabriel, sent from the presence of God. Immediately, Zacharias should have dispelled any if in his mind and believed that God could do it. Now, he might still have the doubt as to how, but he should have had the same attitude that Mary had, and that is, nothing is impossible with God. Now, here's faith. Faith of if doubts, faith of how doubts. One faith is not acceptable. This faith of if is not acceptable. There's probably better words for this, and all I could come up with was if doubts and how doubts. But if doubts was not acceptable. How doubts was. Mary was commended for her faith. Mary even said nothing is impossible with God. So, let's go back to the faith of Abraham. It says there in Galatians chapter 17, when he heard the news, he fell on his face and laughed. Now, I want you to think about, maybe this has occurred to you. Someone comes home or goes someplace, and they get the surprise birthday party has been planned for them, and they walk in and everybody's excited and says happy birthday and everything. And the person for whom the celebration is might say, matter of fact, I've heard say, this is crazy. This is totally unexpected. It's amazing that you did this. And they are so amazed and so pleased and so happy about the news and the honor that's given to them that what do? Oftentimes they even laugh out of giddiness, because they certainly can't doubt what's happening. That's very factual. That's right in their face. There's a celebration in their honor. But they're surprised, and they're also excited, and they're also very flattered, and they might say something to the effect, this is crazy, and laugh. It's kind of a giddiness. This is the faith of Abraham. Abraham received the good news. He received the news of a son from God. Abraham, it says, it laughed, and this would be, this had to be a laugh from very, very pleasant news. If you look at what Paul said there in Romans chapter 4 about the faith of Abraham, picking up 16, for this reason it is by faith, in order that it may be in accordance with grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, the promise, a father of many nations I made you, in the presence of him whom he believed, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. God can do anything. Mary said, nothing is impossible with God. He gave the news, the promise to Abraham, that this is going to happen. Verse 18, in hope against hope he believed, so that he might become a father of many nations, according to that which had been spoken. So shall your descendants be. Now, in Abraham's case, his faith did not constitute if doubts. In Abraham's case, his was how doubts. He didn't know how God would accomplish that, but he knew God would. There was no question in his mind. God could do it. There was no if about it. Abraham's faith was, he might doubt how God could do it. That's evidenced by the fact that, wait a minute, what about my son Ishmael? And God said, no, not Ishmael. In fact, you're going to have a son in your very old age, very advanced years. It's going to happen. And for this news, Abraham was happy, even giddy. That talks about he laughed. He didn't suffer from thinking if. He didn't doubt whether God could do it. He just didn't know how God would do it. His was a how doubt, just like Mary when she receives the news. Just like Mary, Abraham knew nothing is impossible with God. That's the faith of Abraham. Not the faith of Zacharias, the faith of Abraham, and that's what was credited to him as righteousness. In verse 18, in hope against hope, he believed. In all three instances, Abraham, Zacharias, and Mary, they're presented with the impossible. Each an impossible piece of information to digest. It was Zacharias who saw that information so impossible, he didn't think God could do it. And that's why he asked for certainty. Whereas Abraham and Mary, in their minds, they knew God could do it. They just didn't know how. And that's where their doubts arose. In hope against hope, he believed so that he might become a father of many nations according to that which had been spoken. So shall your descendants be. Verse 19. Without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet, verse 20, yet, With respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God. And as it says, he was fully assured. Someone glued the pages together when I wasn't looking. Wait a minute, I'll get it. Don't send a posse. Fully assured what God had promised, he was able to perform. Who does that sound like? What God has promised, he is able to perform. Sounds just like Mary. Nothing is impossible with God. That is the faith of Abraham. In the case of Zacharias, there's no question. He was faithful. He believed. He was trying to obey the law of Moses. He was trying to glorify Jehovah in his life. He was trying to live according to the Levitical priesthood. But when it came to hearing the impossible as it applied to him directly, he had an if doubt. If doubt was a wrong doubt. If doubt was not the faith of Abraham, it is not the faith that God is looking for. And so as a result, his rebuking was to be struck mute and not able to speak until John was born and named. Verse 22, therefore it was also credited to him as righteousness in the case of Abraham. Now, Paul makes a very interesting statement here. He says, not for his sake only was it written that it was credited to him, but for our sake also, to whom it will be credited as those who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. We need the faith of Abraham. We need the faith where there is no if, there might be how, but it is the faith that with God nothing is impossible. The faith of Mary. That's the faith of Abraham. That's the faith we need to define as we talk about the faith that is credited to us as righteousness. Verse 25, he who was delivered over because of our transgressions and was raised because of our justification. Jesus was the Son of God. Could Jesus obey all of the works of the law of Moses without violation? Yes. With God, nothing is impossible. Could Jesus be our justification? Yes. With God, nothing is impossible. Through Jesus, we have forgiveness of sins? Yes. With God, nothing is impossible. And so we find that having faith in Jesus requires us to have the same faith as Abraham, that with God, nothing is impossible, and he has sent his Son to be our redemption. And so it is that Paul has now come full circle with respect to the Jews and has shown them they need that, yes, they have the law of Moses, yes, they have the rite of circumcision, but they need the grace of God. And that grace comes through the faith of Abraham, faith like Abraham, to access the grace of God as it's outlined in the gospel. And the beauty of all of this is the Jews might say, wait a minute, we have the law of Moses. How can someone live perfectly before God? How can someone be resurrected from the dead? Mary said it all. Mary should have put the words that were put in their mouth should have been Mary's words. With God, nothing is impossible. And that's chapter 5. So thank you for your attention, and we'll pick it up there.